Welcome to the stream. I'm Heidi Jo Castro. For decades, labor unions have been on the front line of efforts to protect and improve worker rights. But as the global climate crisis intensifies, they are demanding a worker-friendly, just transition away from fossil fuel-based economies. The UN's International Labor Organization will discuss ways to achieve a just transition in its annual conference next week. The ILO's Global Coordinator for Green Jobs explains what that term means.
A just transition means promoting environmentally sustainable economies in a way that is fair and inclusive to everyone concerned: workers, enterprises, communities. It implies maximizing the social and economic opportunities of climate and environmental action while minimizing and carefully managing any challenges. Just transition matters for all countries at all levels of development. It is important for all economic sectors, informal as well as formal economy, in urban and rural areas alike.
Joining our conversation today from Johannesburg, Ines Mbodi is Secretary of the National Shop Stewards Council at Eskom, South Africa's energy utility. He's also a commissioner on the Presidential Climate Change Commission. Diana Junqueira Curiel is Director of Energy and Just Transition at IndustriAll, a global labor union federation. She is in Geneva. And Annabella Rosenberg is Senior Advisor on Just Transitions at the Climate Action Network. She has years of experience examining environment and labor-related issues. She is in Paris. And you can also be part of today's conversation. Please send us your comments and questions for our panel on YouTube. First, thank you so much to our guests for joining us. I want to first establish what is at stake here. Why are we talking about this today? The ILO says the climate crisis is quickly becoming the greatest threat to workers everywhere. Diana, your federation represents tens of thousands of workers across the globe. Who are the most vulnerable and how are they faring?
Yeah, we could say that now the workers at the industrial sectors are in the forefront of this climate crisis, and that's why we need to take actions as soon as possible. They have many challenges as they don't know how the future looks like for them. They don't know where the new jobs are going to be, how those jobs looks like, and if they are going to be decent jobs. And this is one of the main demands, how they are going to face these decent jobs and make them for all of them, because as Mustafa was saying at the beginning, they are also going to have differences, but everyone is going to be impacted no matter where they are.
Everyone indeed. Ines, what does the threat of climate change look like for a metal or a coal worker in South Africa?
Yeah, and this is a very difficult moment for the metal workers because everybody else is probably thumb-sucking when it comes to the issue of jobs. And jobs are very, very important in an economy like South Africa. South Africa is an economy which is a low-growth economy. And when you lose a job, you are most unlikely to find another job. So the issue of closure of power stations willy-nilly is problematic because we don't believe that just transition is supposed to happen at the pace which exclude the ordinary worker in the streets. So for the metal workers, just transition is not just until the workers say it is just. It will remain an ideal that needs to be tested against the better judgment of the workers.
From ideal to actions, right? That's why we're here today. Annabella, you have worked in both the labor and the green movements, and I think historically there's been a perception that those two things may be at odds, but that doesn't appear to be the case anymore, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is also the history of the just transition concept, what makes it also very interesting and very powerful for uniting those two worlds. This idea that workers should not be put in a situation where they have to choose between the jobs and their health or the environment or the safety of their communities due to climate change. Because I think, of course, there is a specific challenge in the energy sector and to the industrial sector that I'm sure we are going to be talking about. But I think it's also very important to realize that the challenge of the climate crisis impacts heavily on every single worker around the world. Let's think about firefighters, for example, right now fighting terrible fires all around, agricultural workers whose conditions are becoming impossible due to extreme heat, like in India. We can think also about health workers that are going to be working even tougher conditions because of what climate is generating. I think that is also the reason why unions internationally and industrial is part of this effort, have organized to ensure that we are and unions are on the right side of history. And at the same time, raising the voices for workers in this conversation, which are often not heard.
And speaking of raising those voices, there have been more and more protests in which we see both labor and climate activists raising their voices together. Let's watch this clip from a climate action rally in Munich in March, where we do see those two sides join forces.
Many people in this country are losing their hope at this moment, and they are asking themselves, if the politicians can't get it done, then who? And the answer to this question is easy. We will do it. Us.
We need a policy change for transport. We need public transport so that we can do something about countering climate change. And I am really pleased that Fridays for Future are with us on this.
It's important to talk about these protests, but it's also important to talk about examples of when things have worked. And Diana, I know you've been paying close attention to developments in Europe, including in Spain, which I've read is now an example, perhaps, a model for other places to follow. Can you tell us what's happening there?
Yeah, indeed. What is happening in Spain is that thanks to the government that is in place right now, they started with an energy law, with an energy frame that covers one of the parts is about the just transition. That law is also about providing energy frame in the medium and long term, but also in order to give transparency, but also possibilities for investors and to have some ideas about how the future looks like for the country in the energy sector. But the key thing here is about the just transition and is how this is developed. They created the Just Transition Institute, that is a body that works in a tripartite level and is represented by the government at national but also at regional levels, the employers' representatives, but also the unions. Workers are there, and they have been working together in different plans, different programs, like the closure of the coal mines, for example, but also the closure of the thermal power plants.
That's right. And the Spanish government reaching a deal with those mining unions back in 2018 to support communities through a just transition. Now, that's a few years ago. Have we seen this actually put in practice, Diana?
Yeah, this is already happening, but it's not perfect. We could say that we cannot see the perfect just transition plan so far. This is why we are working so hard. But it's very good. It's very close to be perfect. The only thing that we can see is that this program wasn't made with anticipation enough to be prepared for the future. For when you close the coal mines or the thermal power plants, what is next? Because when you are closing, you have the workers there, and those workers, you have to multiply everything for 4, because these workers have families behind, but also they live in communities, they close in the shops, so there is much more that they have around. Mm-hmm. So the main issue that we could see there is about the time that it was not very well controlled, and now they are starting to develop the projects and in the renewable energies. Mm-hmm. To be implemented in those areas. Mm-hmm. But the ideal is that will be done before, much earlier, mm-hmm. in order to have a proper transition and quick for workers.
So a good start. Annabella, please
I
jump
think
in.
something that is also quite interesting, and just to give the audience a sense of the scale of that example, because I think like we have in Spain, I mean, we are talking about 20,000 workers roughly affected in the, I mean, both coal mining, what remaining of coal mining plus the power plant, I mean, like coal-fired power plants. And in 4 years, they've managed to regain roughly the amount of jobs that were lost.
Wow.
But I think it's really important to think that when we are thinking about South Africa, and when we are thinking about Colombia, when we are thinking about Indonesia, places where the energy transition is being discussed, we're talking about a scale that is much bigger than what we are seeing today in Europe. And that is happening in a context where people don't have a safety net, when even the basics of social protection are not secured. And this is what Brother Enos was saying, like the fear for job loss is much higher, also because people have very little to hold with in a time of uncertainty. I think it's also important to notice that the coalition between Greens and Blues or Reds, I mean, between environmentalists and unions, is also getting stronger in places where some governments are not necessarily hearing to the demands. We are seeing this in Canada, but we are also seeing very interesting progress, for example, between oil workers and the environmental movement in Colombia, where the government is listening and putting in place an extremely ambitious transition. So to say that the landscape of cooperation in creating this blue and green alliance is happening, and I would say probably with a bit of like humility on the environmental side, finally, because for a long time, social justice was the little sister for environmentalists, and I think it's good time for us to start catching up.
I can hear what others are saying, but for me in South Africa, there is a big problem. The big problem that we have is the global north is busy sponsoring us to close our power stations quicker when they themselves are not really sure of what the transition is bringing out to them. For instance, I mean, December 2022, 720% increase in the importation of coal to Europe. What is Europe doing to coal that they don't want us to do with the coal? Firstly, I think the best thing to do is to answer the question of transition honestly and openly. Otherwise, we are being bullied because people are sponsoring us to close quicker when they themselves are firing their power stations using coal. And not unless somebody would say to me, they are producing ice cream with this coal. But if they are powering the power stations, then we have got a false debate that the Europeans are sponsoring us to close power stations so that they can actually give us money that deepens our debt crisis. For instance, in South Africa, I checked the statistics. We were sitting at the debt to GDP ratio, which is at 71.0%. And this is a country with with low economic growth, with young people at 60%, more than 60% unemployed. And so in the long run, we realize that when we do just transition by borrowing money from the global north, we are robbing ourselves, because the global north is supposed to be paying for the damage they cause to the climate, not give us loans, but give us grants and reparate. Make sure that the countries may not carry the burden of dealing with climate change by borrowing money.
So Enos,
it is entrenching generations to come.
Is a solution here
a debt crisis?
Is it the pace then of this transition? Is that one of the major problems, that not all countries are on the same page as far as how quickly this can be done in a responsible way that protects workers?
Yes, it is the pace, and this pace is not determined sovereignly, and that is the problem, because we believe just transition should be sovereignly driven at the pace we can afford. The pace we can afford talks to procedural justice, making sure that we don't leave anyone out, making sure that we have got distributive justice. All those things are done at a pace. There is no way you can just determine a pace from somewhere on behalf of a country like South Africa.
Yes, Deanna, go ahead.
I don't think that it's only the pace. I agree that the pace is key, but I also think that it's about the strategy, and it's planning in advance and thinking about it. How do you want it? I mean, you have to tell them. You need to raise your voice and tell them what you have to say, because we, the unions, the workers, have to be at the table, and that's the key of all this transition. So you need to make and develop the plan, the strategy jointly with them.
And the international...
Whilst we're doing that, Europe and other countries that are giving us monies, they are pressing buttons that determines the speed. That is basically what the problem is. And, I understand what you're saying. In Europe, maybe things are happening quite well. But in South Africa in particular, we know that we don't have a sovereignly driven just transition. There are hands all over the show, all over the money that are given to us. There is pace being determined not by ourselves.
The International
if you are
Monetary
now
Fund,
talking about,
Enos,
for instance, the issue of carbon borders.
Yeah, Enos, I know.
Making sure that there is imposition of tariffs on our products. Of course, you are pushing us. You are giving us speed that is not equal to our ability.
That push.
And that is a problem.
That push is coming from global agencies, including the International Monetary Fund. And Annabella, I wanted to bring you back in because there was a report written by the IMF and released last year. I'm pulling it up here on my computer. It has a pretty convincing title, Getting on Track to Net Zero, Accelerating a Global Just Transition in This Decade. Annabella, give us a critique.
Well, the main critique of that report is that it only mentions just transition in the heading, which shows the level of ambition that sometimes we have in our global authorities. And I hear Hino's anger about who's making decisions about the just transition and which words are we using. And it sometimes feels like a concept that has been so dear for the labor movement that is being embraced by the climate justice movement. Now is being diluted in a bunch of plans, in a bunch of reports that are not really talking to that ambition. And this is as much what is happening with the just energy transition partnerships that Enos is talking about. Initially, a very interesting idea that for once, the global north would be supporting emerging economies and developing countries in getting out of industries that need to be transformed, that could create jobs, but we are not seeing any job. Until now, everything that has happened in South Africa with the Just Energy Transition Partnerships have been conversations about the liberalization of the electricity markets in South Africa. And that was not the deal. That was not what we want the just transition to be used for. And I think it's, again, we are coming here, and I know we were saying at the beginning, real world examples. Fact is that real world examples are very few because the level of ambition of governments right now is still low. And of course, there are matters of dependency between North and South. But I think also as Southern citizens, we also need to call out our own governments for their lack of vision and their lack of ambition on the direction they want to give to our countries. We cannot continue in a path of dependency and extractivism, which is what coal and all the minerals are giving us. I mean, terrible health. They are giving us jobs, indeed, but those are not necessarily what the next generations need. They need new alternatives. They need new opportunities. So there is a lot of hypocrisy in the air, and I absolutely agree with that. And there is a lack of leadership.
I'm glad we're talking about this.
Yeah.
And I think this will also be discussed next week when the ILO meets. Deanna, I know you will be there in person. What do you think what kind of actionable things may come out of this meeting to build upon the words that have been tossed around?
Yeah, I think that after 10 years is the moment that we are all expecting, just to make this just transition real. As Enos was mentioning, this is not happening, and this is going in a very different paces. What we are expecting expecting is to get concrete actions. One of them could be developing just transition plans that can be done at regional level, national company level. But we need to see those plans, those strategies in place. But we also need to see the money, where the money is coming from and where it's going to. Because all this is also about money, about financing this transition, because this will have a cost. Who is going to pay that? What we cannot permit is that workers pay this transition. This is totally unfair, and this is what we cannot do.
Enos,
Yeah.
are you?
Yeah, but in South Africa, workers are on the verge of being sacrificed. On the verge of being sacrificed because they are being promised things that are not practical and pragmatic. The closure of Komati power station, it's a point that we can refer to, where workers were just moved to another power station, which means more and more of the power stations being closed. When people are moved to other power stations, we will be writing a business case for retrenchments. And that is very, very scary. We cannot do transition that way. We should have really pathways that are practical and pragmatic. And also there should be a replanning of the economy around the places where the disinvestments are happening, which didn't happen in South Africa, by the way. There was no replanning of the economy. The people in Komati didn't know anything that was happening there. The workers didn't even know what was happening. We do know that there are a few people who would say workers are supposed to know. But, when companies are driving people from one power station to another, it is a problem because it is writing a business case for them to be retrenched when other power stations will become over-established in no time. That is problematic indeed.
The problems here, is it that Global South voices are not speaking loud enough, or is it that the Global North isn't listening?
No, the Global North, the idea of the Global North giving us loans, it's a problem. They need to be reparating, but they must allow us to drive the transition. Them listening or not, I've spoken to several envoys from different countries. I'm not too sure whether they even listen to us. We keep on harping on the same thing, that you are responsible for the major damage to the climate. You are not supposed to be giving loans. You are supposed to be reparating. You are supposed to increase the grant aspect of the finance of the climate damage to mitigate and to adapt. We don't need to get into debt because of how you damage the economy, the climate. Because developed countries damaged the climate largely when they were busy industrializing. Now they need to give us the money so that we may be able to mitigate and adapt, but in the speed and the pace we can afford.
Yeah. Unfortunately, our time is almost coming to a close. Annabella, I want to come to you because you've said stubborn optimism. That's a term that has united labor and green movements. What do you mean by that?
Well, I guess what I want to mean with that is that we know the transition is going to happen. What we don't know if it's going to be just, because justice is only a result of mobilization and a power struggle. And I hear absolutely all the frustration, but I think this is also a moment for raising together with demands, with a strategy, and pushing both North and South in delivering for workers and communities. There is still everything to be built about climate strategies. This is only the beginning. And if there's one thing I learned in my 15 years working with the trade union movement, that it's not only important to know when you win, but the most important thing is to know when you are losing, to keep fighting for winning. And I think that level of stubborn optimism is certainly one that the environmental justice groups would learn a lot from.
Yeah.
So because we have a massive challenge ahead.
Thank you so
and I'm
much,
hopeful
Annabella.
of our mobilization.
Thank you so much. Your message to not give up, but also to listen closely to tough conversations. Those are both important. Thank you so much to all of our guests, and that is all for today. But you can always find us online at stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for joining us for this important conversation.